At my dad's retirement party, he announced, "From now on, 30% of your salary will support the household. It's only fair." My mom laughed. My sister smirked. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, until they handed me a legal form. I tore it in half and walked out. The next morning, I woke up to 16 missed calls. I, 24M, never thought my dad's retirement party would be the night everything changed. The backyard was decorated with those cheap streamers from the dollar store, and Mom had made her famous potato salad that nobody really liked, but everyone pretended to love. My sister was there with her husband and kids, playing the perfect daughter as usual. Everything seemed normal until Dad stood up with his beer, cleared his throat, and dropped a bomb that would destroy our family forever. He announced that from now on, 30% of my salary would go towards supporting the household because it was only fair. Mom started laughing like he'd told the funniest joke in the world. My sister smirked and nodded along like this was the most reasonable thing she'd ever heard. I laughed too, thinking it had to be some kind of retirement humor gone wrong. Then Mom pulled out a manila folder from under the gift table and handed it to me with that same smile still plastered on her face. Inside was a legal document, professionally typed and notarized, outlining how I would be required to contribute 30% of my gross income to what they called the Family Maintenance Fund. My hands shook as I read through the terms. They had actually consulted a lawyer about this. I looked around at their expectant faces and realized they were completely serious. Without saying a word, I tore the document in half, dropped the pieces on the patio table, and walked straight out of that backyard. Behind me, I could hear Dad yelling about respect and responsibility, but I kept walking until I reached my car. The next morning, I woke up to 16 missed calls. 12 from Mom, 3 from Dad, and 1 from my sister. My phone was buzzing again when I finally checked it around 9 a.m. This time it was Mom, and she was furious. She demanded I come home immediately to discuss my childish behavior and sign a new copy of the agreement. She said they'd had the lawyer prepare multiple copies because they knew I might react poorly. I told her I wasn't coming home and I wasn't signing anything. She started crying, saying I was abandoning my family when they needed me most. Dad got on the phone and his voice was ice cold. He informed me that if I didn't comply with their reasonable request, I would no longer be welcome in their home. My sister had apparently been in the room during this call because I could hear her in the background saying I was being selfish and ungrateful. That's when the real story came out. Dad explained that he'd been planning this for months. With his retirement, their household income was going to drop significantly, and they decided I needed to step up as the man of the family. My sister was exempt because she had her own family to support, but I was single and making good money at my engineering job, so it was my duty to help. I asked him why they hadn't discussed this with me beforehand, and he said they knew I would have said no, so they decided to present it as a done deal. Mom chimed in that they'd raised me and supported me for 24 years, so now it was time for me to support them. The entitlement in their voices made my blood boil. I hung up and immediately started making plans. Within a week, I'd found a new apartment across town and hired movers. I didn't tell them I was moving out until the day it happened. When Mom called that afternoon wondering where all my stuff had gone, I calmly explained that I was an adult who could live wherever I wanted. The harassment started immediately. They began calling my workplace, claiming there was a family emergency and demanding to speak with me. My boss pulled me aside after the third call in one day and asked if everything was okay at home. I had to explain the situation, which was humiliating, but my boss was understanding and said he'd have HR block their numbers. Mom showed up at my new apartment building and convinced the building manager to let her wait in the lobby. When I came home from work, she was sitting there with tears in her eyes, holding another copy of that damn legal agreement. She started her performance about how hurt and disappointed they were, how they'd never expected their own son to abandon them in their time of need. I sat down across from her and asked her to explain exactly why I owed them 30% of my income. She launched into this speech about family obligations and how successful children have a responsibility to support their aging parents. I pointed out that Dad was only 58 and perfectly healthy, and she was 55 and could easily get a job if money was tight. That's when her mask slipped. She admitted they weren't actually struggling financially. Dad's pension was decent, and they had savings. But they wanted to maintain their current lifestyle without having to downsize or make sacrifices. They figured since I was doing well and didn't have a wife or kids, I should contribute to funding their comfortable retirement. I told her to leave and never show up at my building again. She started crying harder and said I was breaking her heart. Before she left, she warned me that this wasn't over and that family loyalty meant something, even if I'd forgotten that. The next phase of their campaign involved my extended family. Suddenly, aunts and uncles I barely talked to were calling me, saying they'd heard I was refusing to help my parents. Someone had clearly given them a very different version of the story, because they all seemed to think I was just being stubborn about contributing a small amount to help with groceries or utilities. When I explained what they'd actually demanded, most of my relatives went quiet. My uncle finally said that 30% seemed excessive, but maybe I could work out some kind of compromise. I told him there would be no compromise because the entire premise was insane. My sister ramped up her involvement around this time. She started posting cryptic messages on social media about family values and how some people forget where they came from. When that didn't get my attention, she began calling me directly with increasingly aggressive demands that I stop being selfish and think about what was best for the family. During one particularly heated call, she revealed that she'd been encouraging our parents to take this hardline approach. She thought I'd been getting too comfortable and needed to learn some responsibility. She also mentioned that she and her husband had been discussing their own financial pressures, and it would be nice if everyone contributed to a family fund that could help out in emergencies. I realized this wasn't just about mom and dad's retirement. My sister saw an opportunity to create a system where I'd essentially be subsidizing everyone else's lifestyle choices. I told her exactly what I thought of her plan and blocked her number. Things escalated when they decided to involve my workplace again, but more strategically this time. Dad called my company's main line and told them he was concerned about my mental health because I'd been acting erratically and making poor decisions. He suggested someone should check on me to make sure I was handling my responsibilities properly. This backfired spectacularly. My boss called me into his office, not because he was concerned about my performance, but because he wanted to give me a heads up that someone was trying to sabotage my job. He'd spoken with HR, and they'd documented everything in case my family tried to escalate their harassment. I decided it was time to go nuclear. I'd been documenting everything since the beginning, saving voicemails, taking screenshots of text messages, and keeping records of every interaction. I compiled everything into a detailed email and sent it to every family member who'd contacted me about this situation. The email laid out exactly what had happened, including the original demand, the legal document they'd tried to force me to sign, and every manipulative tactic they'd used since then. I attached photos of the torn agreement and screenshots of my sister's social media posts. I ended by explaining that I was cutting contact with anyone who continued to support or enable this behavior. The response was immediate and divided. Some relatives apologized and said they hadn't understood the full situation. Others doubled down and said I was being dramatic and should have found a way to help my family without causing all this drama. Mom's reaction was to show up at my apartment building again, this time with Dad. Building security called me before letting them up, and I told them not to allow my parents access to the building. Through the intercom system, Dad demanded I come down and talk to them like a man instead of hiding behind security guards. I went down to the lobby, but I brought my phone and started recording as soon as I saw them. Dad was furious about the email and accused me of trying to turn the family against them. Mom was crying again, but this time it seemed more manipulative than genuine. She kept saying she couldn't understand how I'd become so cruel and heartless. I asked them directly if they were willing to drop their demand for 30% of my income. Dad said they'd be willing to negotiate the percentage, but the principle remained the same. I told them there would be no negotiation because I didn't owe them a penny beyond normal gifts and occasional help with genuine emergencies. That's when Dad played his final card. He told me I had 1 week to reconsider, or they would pursue legal action to enforce what they called their parental support rights. I laughed and told them to go ahead and try. No lawyer in the world would support a case demanding 30% of an adult child's income just because the parents wanted extra spending money. Mom started sobbing and saying I was destroying the family. She begged me to think about holidays and family gatherings, asking how we could ever be together again after all this damage. I told her that was entirely up to them. They could drop this ridiculous demand and apologize, or they could lose their son permanently. They chose to escalate. A week later, I received a letter from a lawyer demanding I respond to their client's request for financial support within 10 days. The letter was full of legal language about filial responsibility and family obligations, but it was clearly an intimidation tactic rather than a real legal threat. I forwarded the letter to a lawyer friend who specialized in family law. She laughed when she read it and explained that while some states have filial responsibility laws, they're rarely enforced and typically only apply when elderly parents are destitute and need government assistance. My parents' comfortable retirement didn't come close to meeting those criteria. Update 1. I sent a response through my lawyer friend, basically telling their attorney that his clients had no legal standing and that any further harassment would result in a restraining order. The legal threats stopped immediately, which confirmed that their lawyer had probably told them the same thing mine told me. But my family wasn't done yet. My sister organized what she called an intervention. She invited me to what I thought was a casual family dinner at a restaurant, but when I arrived, half our extended family was there. They'd planned this ambush to pressure me into giving in to my parents' demands. My aunt started the conversation by saying everyone was worried about the family falling apart over money. My cousin suggested that maybe we could find a compromise that worked for everyone. My sister sat there looking smug while various relatives took turns explaining why I should be more flexible and understanding. I let them finish their speeches, then stood up and addressed the room. I explained once again that this wasn't about helping family members in need. This was about my parents demanding a permanent percentage of my income to fund their lifestyle choices, with no accountability for how the money would be spent and no end date for the arrangement. I pointed out that none of them had volunteered to contribute 30% of their own incomes to this family fund my sister kept mentioning. I asked my aunt if she'd be willing to give up 30% of her salary to help my parents, and she admitted she couldn't afford to do that. The room got quiet when I asked my sister directly how much she was contributing to support our parents. She stammered that her situation was different because she had kids and a mortgage. I reminded everyone that I was 24 years old and trying to build my own life, but apparently my goals and dreams mattered less than everyone else's. I left the restaurant and blocked several more phone numbers that night. My extended family's involvement had made it clear that this wasn't going to end until I made it end. Update 2. The final confrontation happened at my grandfather's birthday party 2 months later. I'd been debating whether to attend, but he was turning 80 and I didn't want to miss it because of my parents' behavior. I figured with so many people around, they'd be forced to behave civilly. I was wrong. Dad had apparently been drinking before I arrived, and he started loudly complaining to anyone who would listen about his ungrateful son who refused to help his struggling parents. He was telling people I was making 6 figures and living in luxury while they worried about paying bills. When I tried to correct his lies about their financial situation, he got aggressive. He started yelling that he'd sacrificed everything to raise me, and now I was throwing it back in his face. Mom joined in, crying dramatically about how she'd failed as a mother because she'd raised such a selfish child. My grandfather, who'd been quiet during most of the family drama, finally spoke up. He told everyone to sit down and shut up because he was tired of listening to this nonsense at every family gathering. Then he turned to my parents and said something that changed everything. He told them he was embarrassed by their behavior and disappointed that they'd tried to manipulate me into funding their retirement. He said he'd raised Dad to be independent and self-sufficient, not to expect handouts from his children. He looked directly at my sister and said he was especially disappointed that she'd encouraged this situation instead of talking sense into her parents. The room went completely silent. My grandfather had always been the family patriarch, and his word carried weight with everyone. When he told my parents they owed me an apology and needed to drop their financial demands immediately, several other relatives nodded in agreement. Dad's face turned red, but he didn't dare argue with his own father. Mom stopped crying and sat there looking shocked that her manipulation tactics weren't working on Grandpa. My sister looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. But the most important thing my grandfather said was directed at me. He told me he was proud of how I'd handled the situation and that setting boundaries with family members was sometimes necessary, even when it was painful. He said I'd shown more maturity and integrity than the adults who'd been trying to pressure me. That party marked the turning point. Several relatives approached me privately to apologize for getting involved without understanding the full situation. A few admitted they'd been given a very different version of events and felt manipulated themselves. Update 3. It's been 6 months since my grandfather's birthday party, and the family dynamics have completely shifted. My parents finally dropped their financial demands, but they've never apologized for their behavior. They act like the whole thing never happened and get upset when I don't immediately return to our previous relationship. I maintain limited contact with them now. I attend major family events, but I don't visit their house or have long phone conversations. When they bring up money or try to guilt me about family obligations, I change the subject or leave. They've learned I won't tolerate that kind of manipulation anymore. My sister has tried to rebuild our relationship, but there's too much damage. She played a major role in encouraging our parents' demands and trying to pressure me into compliance. I'm polite to her at family gatherings, but I don't trust her anymore. She's made several comments about hoping we can get past this disagreement, but she's never acknowledged her part in creating the problem. The most positive outcome has been strengthening my relationship with my grandfather and several cousins who supported me once they understood what was really happening. My grandfather has made it clear that he disapproves of parents who try to financially exploit their adult children, and his stance has influenced other family members. I've also learned valuable lessons about setting boundaries and standing up for myself. There were moments when I questioned whether I was being too harsh or stubborn, but I realized that giving in to unreasonable demands only encourages more unreasonable behavior. My parents occasionally make comments about how I'll understand their perspective when I'm older and have children of my own. They seem to believe that parenthood automatically entitles them to a percentage of their adult children's income. I've made it clear that my future children will be raised to be independent and self-sufficient, not to view their parents as permanent financial obligations. The financial demand was ultimately about control, not money. They wanted to maintain influence over my life decisions by making me financially dependent on their approval. When I refused to accept that arrangement, they tried every manipulation tactic they could think of to force compliance. Standing up to family pressure was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was necessary. I couldn't build my own life while being expected to fund theirs. The relationship with my parents may never fully recover, but I've gained respect from family members who matter to me and learned to trust my own judgment even when everyone else is telling me I'm wrong. Looking back, I'm glad I tore up that legal document and walked out of the retirement party. It was the moment I stopped being their child and started being my own person. The 16 missed calls the next morning were just the beginning of a battle I had to fight to establish my independence, but it was a battle worth winning.